What happens when a racist landlord picks the wrong couple to bully? The couple raised the very man who writes the laws he thinks he can break. The cold London wind blew against the cracked windows of flat 3B as Martin Rhodes sat quietly at the small kitchen table, his rough hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, unaware that this peaceful morning was about to shatter. Evelyn stood beside him stirring porridge, humming softly, her eyes full of love, unaware of the storm creeping toward their door. Their peace broke when a loud knock echoed through the hallway, sharp and aggressive, the kind of knock meant to intimidate, the kind meant to remind someone of their place. Thomas Bennett stood outside, a smirk on his face, papers in hand, acting as if the old couple he was staring at were unwanted clutter in his building. He waved the eviction notice like a trophy, pretending it was just business, but his cold eyes told another story, a story of prejudice, of assumptions, of a man who believed he held power simply because he owned the walls around them. Evelyn's trembling hands held the notice while Thomas spoke down to them, telling them they had 30 days to disappear, as if their decades of loyalty and rent meant nothing. Martin stood straight, his calm voice cracking slightly as he asked for the reason, but Thomas only smirked and muttered something about new tenants who are more suitable. The unspoken meaning hung heavy in the air, and Evelyn felt her heart sink, the familiar sting of discrimination tightening her chest. But Thomas made a fatal mistake when he said, "People like you should be grateful you were allowed to live here this long," unaware that behind these gentle elderly faces was a son who had fought against men far more powerful than him. Evelyn whispered, "We will not be treated this way," and Thomas laughed, enjoying the moment, thinking he had already won. But Martin walked calmly to the little wooden cabinet and pulled out his old mobile phone, hands steady, eyes determined. "We will call our son," he said softly. Thomas scoffed, rolling his eyes, expecting some ordinary man with no influence, but when Evelyn added, "Our son, Judge Adrian Rhodes," the color drained from Thomas's face. The confidence cracked, the arrogance faltered, and the hallway fell silent, because the man he was trying to evict was the mother and father of a federal judge who had shut down corrupt landlords and illegal evictions across the UK. Martin placed the phone on the table and whispered, "No one pushes us out of our home." Evelyn squeezed his hand, courage rising inside her fragile frame, and as the clock ticked, Thomas realized he had just stepped into a battle he could not win. Subscribe to follow what happens next and comment, "Justice," if you believe every elder deserves respect. Thomas Bennett stood frozen in the dim hallway, the thin eviction papers trembling slightly in his hand as Evelyn and Martin Rhodes exchanged a calm but knowing glance, a glance only parents with deep faith in their child's strength could share. Martin's old mobile lay on the kitchen table like a silent weapon, reminding Thomas that this was not an ordinary elderly couple he could intimidate, but the parents of a man who had changed lives with the authority of his pen and the firmness of his judgment. Evelyn closed the door gently, her hands steady, but inside her heart raced as she tried to calm the storm rising in her chest, because the words Thomas had spoken replayed cruelly in her mind, words meant to belittle her, to reduce her to nothing more than an inconvenience he wanted gone. Martin walked back to the chair, lowering himself slowly, every movement heavy with both age and silent strength, while Evelyn sat beside him, gripping his hand tightly, refusing to let fear win. Outside, Thomas stepped back, breathing sharply, trying to recover his fake confidence, his mind racing as he muttered to himself that they were bluffing, that no judge would care about such a small matter, that these two old people could not possibly have someone powerful protecting them. He told himself lies to calm the growing panic in his chest, but deep down he knew he had gone too far. Inside the flat, Martin took a deep breath and finally dialed the number he had memorized years ago, the number of the boy he had adopted at age 9 from a broken foster system, the boy who had once slept on their couch because he was too frightened to be alone, the boy who grew into a man who fought corruption head-on. Adrian Rhodes answered within seconds, his calm voice instantly filled with concern as he heard the strain in his father's greeting, and the tone of the room shifted from fear to sharp, focused resolve. Evelyn explained what had happened, her voice trembling only once when she repeated the words Thomas had thrown at them, and Adrian's silence on the other end was louder than anger, a silence that meant action, swift and unstoppable, was already forming in his mind. Adrian said softly, "Do not worry, Mum, Dad, I will be there." And when he ended the call, Evelyn felt tears fill her eyes because she knew that when Adrian promised something, even mountains seemed to move. Thomas returned to the hallway, packing nervously, replaying the name he had just heard, Judge Adrian Rhodes, a name spoken in courtrooms with respect, fear, and power, a name connected to landmark rulings and televised hearings, a name that landlords whispered about when discussing illegal evictions. Thomas tried to convince himself he could still win, that the building laws were on his side, but he knew the truth. If Adrian got involved, there would be consequences far beyond losing a tenant. Back inside the flat, Evelyn began tidying up automatically, a habit she fell into whenever she was anxious, while Martin simply watched her with gentle eyes, whispering, "We raised him right, Eve, and now he fights for us." She nodded, wiping a stray tear, overwhelmed with both pain and pride, because no matter how many times the world tried to push them down, their son always pulled them back up. Minutes passed, but the weight of the coming confrontation grew heavier, filling the small flat with a tense energy that even the ticking clock could not cut through. Martin placed his hand over Evelyn and whispered, "No one can take our dignity unless we allow it," and she breathed deeply, feeling her strength return. Outside, Thomas's heels clicked against the hall floor as he tried to regain his arrogant posture, but his eyes betrayed him, darting nervously toward the elevator every few seconds, waiting, dreading, anticipating the arrival of the man who could dismantle his entire scheme with one sentence. The air felt electric, charged with the promise of justice, and even Evelyn sensed it, whispering, "He's coming, Martin, our boy is coming home." Martin nodded, lifting his chin, ready to face whatever came next, knowing they were no longer alone. Subscribe to follow the twist in Chapter 3 and comment, "Strength," if you believe no elder should ever be bullied. Adrian Rhodes stepped out of the black car with a calmness that made the entire street seem to pause, his long coat swaying gently in the daylight as he walked toward the building with the quiet authority of someone who had sentenced corrupt officials twice his age. And inside the hallway, Thomas Bennett froze completely because the moment he saw Adrian's face, he realized every fear he had tried to suppress was now standing in front of him in human form. Thomas tried to straighten his posture, but his voice cracked when he said the weak words, "This is a private property," and Adrian stopped only 2 steps away from him, looking directly into his eyes with the same cold stare he used for defendants who lied under oath, a stare that stripped away every excuse and uncovered every truth. Adrian's voice was steady as he asked, "Did you harass my parents?" And though the question was calm, it carried the weight of a hammer about to strike, and Thomas felt his throat tighten because he knew there was no version of this story he could twist to save himself. Before Thomas could respond, the elevator doors slid open and Evelyn appeared in the doorway with her trembling hands clasped together, her eyes filling with relief at the sight of her son, and Martin stood behind her leaning on his cane but holding his head high, because even after all the cruelty they had endured, he refused to bend to anyone's hatred. Adrian moved past Thomas without another word and gently placed his hand on his mother's shoulder, whispering, "I'm here now, Mum," and Evelyn let out a shaky breath, because for the first time since the humiliation began, she felt safe, protected, and seen. Thomas followed behind them, trying to defend himself with excuses about rent delays and standard procedures. But Adrian stopped him with a single raised hand, a gesture so sharp that Thomas fell silent instantly, because he suddenly understood he was no longer dealing with tenants, but with a judge who knew the law far better than he did. Inside the flat, Adrian listened carefully as Evelyn retold everything in a soft voice, each detail making his jaw tighten, and Martin added only one sentence, "He tried to scare your mother," a sentence that hit Adrian harder than anything else, because he knew exactly how deeply Evelyn felt disrespect. When Adrian finally turned back to Thomas, his tone was firm but controlled as he said, "You attempted an illegal eviction, you used threatening language, and you targeted them because you thought their age and their race made them easy victims." And Thomas felt exposed because Adrian had spoken the truth he had tried to bury under fake professionalism. Adrian then informed him that formal complaints, legal notices, and an investigation would begin immediately, and Thomas's fake arrogance evaporated completely as he whispered, "Please, I didn't mean," But Adrian cut him off with 4 calm words that ended all excuses. "You meant every word." Evelyn watched silently, tears forming again, not from sadness, but from witnessing her son stand like a shield between them and the world. And Martin rested a hand on Adrian's shoulder with deep pride, whispering, "Justice isn't just your job, it's who you are." Adrian nodded once, his eyes still fixed on Thomas, knowing this was only the beginning of a battle he was ready to fight for the 2 people who had once fought the world to give him a home. Subscribe if you want Chapter 4 and comment "Justice, if no elder should ever face eviction threats." Adrian Rhodes stood firm in the small living room as Thomas Bennett backed against the wall, his breathing shallow, his confidence gone, because the truth he had tried to hide was now laid bare in front of the very man who had the legal power to destroy his scheme with a single signature. Adrian spoke slowly, each word sharp and clear as glass, explaining that the eviction attempt was illegal, discriminatory, and punishable, and with every sentence Thomas's face paled further until he looked like a man watching his entire future slip from his grasp. Evelyn stood close to her son, her hand touching his arm gently, while Martin lifted his chin with quiet strength, refusing to let the years of disrespect from others break his dignity even for a second. Adrian then pulled out his phone, documenting the state of the building, the dates on the fake notices, and even Thomas's trembling excuses, because he knew that justice required evidence, and he wanted this case airtight so no one could ever question what his parents had endured. Thomas tried to plead again, stuttering promises to fix everything, to withdraw the eviction, to repair the flat. But Adrian's voice remained calm and cold when he replied that the matter was no longer in Thomas's hands, but in the hands of the law, and that the authorities would handle the rest. As Adrian escorted his parents out to give them fresh air, neighbors stepped out quietly, some watching in shame because they had heard the earlier shouting and done nothing. But now they looked at Evelyn and Martin with respect, as if realizing how wrong it had been to ignore their suffering. When the police arrived moments later, Thomas's legs shook under him as he was questioned right in the hallway he once walked with arrogance, and Adrian stood by the elevator with his parents, holding Evelyn's hand while Martin leaned proudly on his cane, grateful that justice had finally walked through their door. Outside the building, Adrian promised them a new home, a safer place, one where no landlord would ever dare to disrespect them again, and Evelyn cried softly into his chest because she had always prayed her son would grow into a man of kindness, strength, and truth. Yet she never imagined he would grow into a federal judge who protected them with the power she once feared the world would use against him. Martin put an arm around both of them and whispered, "This is what love becomes when you raise a child with dignity." And Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the day settle inside him, knowing he had fought not just for justice, but for the 2 people who had once fought the whole world for him. As the sun warmed their faces and Thomas was led away for questioning, Adrian turned to his parents and said gently, "No one will ever hurt you again," and Evelyn smiled through her tears because she finally believed it. Subscribe for more powerful stories and remember the lesson of today. When you stand up for the vulnerable, you don't just protect them, you teach the world what justice truly looks like.